when forensic investigators dug up a well-preserved body one winter's morning in February 2002, they'd unearthed a poisonous Faustian pact that ended with murder.
You write everything off to greed. Outside of that, treachery. I mean, this is a treacherous activity.
So it was death over a period of time, with no attention to try to save his life, and then a lot of thought to go into how to dispose of the body.
Father of three, Lawrence William McNabney was a successful criminal lawyer. Larry seemed to thrive performing in and out of court.
Larry was actually an attorney who had offices both in Vegas and in Reno as well. So he had spent some time in Nevada practicing as an attorney.
When Larry was 23 years old, he was dealt the devastating blow of losing both his father and his older brother within 3 weeks of each other. But in 1995, life was looking up for a rejuvenated Larry McNabney. He was enjoying success in Reno as a personal injury lawyer. Expanding his operations into Las Vegas, he needed an office manager. A keen candidate walked through the door. Her name, she said, was Elisa Riedelsberger.
Larry came to meet her on the day that she appeared at his office in Vegas, answering an advert to become the office manager in Vegas at his law practice. And as it turned out, she was pretty effective as an office manager.
Little did Larry know that Elisa was not all she appeared. Born in January 1966, Elisa's real name was Lorraine Renee Sims. Raised in Florida, she was one of 4 children growing up in a loving, comfortably off family.
As a youngster, she was identified as having an IQ in the 140 range, actually, which is genius level. But interestingly enough, she never finished high school. It would seem that she had kind of a normal life up to a certain point. She was a cheerleader, she was engaged at high school, but just couldn't finish her course of studies there. And it was at that point in time that she began becoming involved in things like petty theft.
By the time she was 20, Elisa had a criminal record and was a mother of 2, by 2 different fathers. Her son went to live with his father. Her daughter Haley lived with her when Elisa wasn't in jail. By the time she was 29 years old, Elisa had fled to Nevada with her daughter, where her bold attitude dazzled Larry, who was then 46. Elisa, however, wasted no time in doing what she knew best: thieving.
She stole a tremendous amount of cash from him.
Elisa had embezzled over $70,000 of client funds. Her theft eventually drew the attention of the Nevada State Bar. But while she took the rap, Larry was probably aware of her actions.
He wound up actually having to close both of the offices for his law practice, the one in Vegas as well as the one in Reno. In spite of her actually stealing from him, he wound up marrying her anyway.
In a glitzy wedding ceremony in Reno, the baffling union between Larry and Elisa took place on January 6, 1996. The couple, however, had likely become mutually dependent on each other. Elisa's silence about Larry's knowledge of the fraud, some speculate, in exchange for Larry's money, and keeping quiet about her crooked past. Over the next 2 years, Elisa prized Larry away from his friends, and family members. And in 1998, they left Reno altogether.
When his business, his law practice finally went belly up, they both moved on to California at that point in time and lived in Sacramento.
In Sacramento, the McNabneys set up a new practice, with Elisa running the office. She advertised for a receptionist. 21-year-old university art student Sarah Dutra applied. Having performed well during high school, Dutra's prospects seemed promising.
She was the office assistant. She was from a ranching family up in Northern California.
Sarah was rewarded with a startlingly handsome salary. Elisa then furnished her with a BMW, credit cards, and expensive shopping trips. To fund it, Elisa was cooking Larry's books and teaching her student the art of fraud.
You have this woman who, for all intents and purposes, could look like she was a socialite who had a very long arrest record, could con people, and then somehow gets a young girl to go in league with her.
Larry seemed oblivious to this fresh round of fraud. His excessive love of wine had been numbing the effects of depression and replacing any affection he and his wife ever shared for each other. Wine was one distraction. Presenting another, Elisa introduced him to quarter horse showing.
She shared a love for horses, show horses, along with Larry, and this is something that they pursued and indulged. There's a lot of money tied up in quarter horse showing.
Larry excelled, winning Rookie of the Year in 1999.
It's kind of an upper crust crowd, if you will, because these animals are very expensive, and they're very expensive to maintain as well.
But Elisa was draining Larry's funds dry. Creditors were pressuring Elisa for payments for the debts she had amassed. Larry, she complained to Sarah, was the source of her problems. His removal, the solution to them. Sarah, relishing the luxurious fruits of her friendship with Elisa, backed her to achieve this vicious end. Elisa asked a trainer about a horse tranquilizer called xylazine.
This particular tranquilizer is going to go to work on the central nervous system, and this is going to impact, say, for instance, even the autonomic nervous system that's giving you the ability that kind of helps us with our heartbeat, helps us with our breathing.
On September 5th, 2001, this troubled trio traveled to Los Angeles for another horse show. Soon after they arrived, Elisa broke into her trainer's truck and stole a syringe and tranquilizer from the medicine bag.
Many horse owners will have possession of this particular agent in order to utilize with their own stock.
Over 4 days, the women spiked Larry 3 times. The first was during the weekend. The second was on Monday, September 10th. As Larry slept, Elisa placed some drops into his mouth and waited. Larry was rendered so drowsy and debilitated, Elisa hired a wheelchair and bought 2 shovels.
The last time that Larry was actually seen alive, he was being pushed in a wheelchair by his then wife, pushing him along with a real inability to be able to effectively communicate, kind of disengaged and listless at that point in time. There was really no explanation why he was in this condition at all. but he was having severe difficulty.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, America suffered its worst ever terrorist attack. While the eyes of their friends were glued in stunned shock to television screens, Elisa and Sarah slipped away from the horse show. Their cargo, a limp Larry McNabney. Heading for Sacramento, they drove via Yosemite National Park to bury his body.
She was laboring under the delusion after she had plied Larry with this medication that he was deceased. She had him in her vehicle and literally was taking him to Yosemite National Forest where she was going to bury his body. But as it turns out, he was actually heavily sedated and still breathing upon arrival.
The women drove back to Elisa's house and dragged Larry upstairs into the bedroom.
It also has some cardiovascular effects as well, dropping of blood pressure, etc. So over a period of time, there would be sort of decreasing level of consciousness, decreasing ability to breathe, dropping blood pressure. And each of those things, had he received some type of medical attention, he could have survived this.
Instead, Elisa dealt him the final, fatal overdose. By the morning of September 12th, he was dead. Within days, Elisa was selling Larry's vehicles, forging his signature, and buying more sports cars, while trying to run an increasingly chaotic office. As November arrived, an employee was the first to notice Larry's strange, long absence. Then, Larry's children became concerned.
They were the ones that persisted in asking the authorities to look for their father. They were then talking to the wife. They were talking to her, and she was giving different explanations as to where he was, what he was doing. He was doing this. He was out of town for this reason, out of town for that reason. So she was creating a fiction that she was feeding to family members who were concerned because their father wasn't available. And they were beginning to suspect something.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
Larry's children were right to. When his birthday came and went without a word from him on December 19th, they knew something was wrong. Sacramento County Sheriff's Department was now treating Larry's disappearance as a missing persons case.
They were being pressured by the family, different members of the family, to search for their father.
Elisa had become a person of interest, but she was last seen driving away in a red Jaguar with her daughter on January 10th, leaving Sarah Dutra in the lurch. In an attempt to save her own skin, Sarah went to the police to share information on the McNabneys. The visit would soon backfire. A month later, a field worker tending a vineyard in San Joaquin Valley came across a macabre sight.
Some agricultural workers who were passing through the vineyard, and they noticed that there were toes sticking above ground. Actually, I believe what they first noticed is that there were some birds out there, and then they grew closer and they saw that there was something actually protruding above ground that the birds had actually been resting on.
On the morning of February 5th, 2002, forensic pathologist Dr. Terry Haddix received a call.
A body is found in a vineyard, and it wasn't as though someone had just collapsed. this individual had actually been buried. And the grave, as it turns out, was relatively superficial. And when the body was found, or what drew the attention to the body, was the fact that there were some portions of one of the lower extremities that was protruding above the level of the ground. So obviously that's profoundly suspicious, and accordingly we have to figure out why the person died and who did this.
Forensic pathologist Dr. Terry Haddocks joined the investigation team at the crime scene.
When I arrived out at the scene, the excavation was in its very early stages. They had been out there for some hours earlier, but they were meticulously clearing the very superficial layers, sifting the dirt, etc. But when I was out there, no one had any inkling, or no one told me that there were any suspicions of who this individual could have been.
Forensic archaeologist Professor Roger Lajeunesse was asked to remove the body from the ground and made an intriguing discovery.
A pair of scissors. I could see that it had probably been used to cut the back of a T-shirt off of the decedent to obscure his identification, because apparently the T-shirt said something about a quarter horse show in Los Angeles that they had attended, and so they had cut it off like that and taken it apart.
Elisa and Sarah's attempts to render Larry unidentifiable failed as the body emerged from his shallow grave.
Just looking in terms of him physically, he was close to being visually identifiable at the time that we removed him out of the ground. The things which stood out were some tattoos which were located on his arms. Also, obviously, the clothing, the nature of the clothing that was present there. While we were at the scene, I do recall that there was a detective that had raised the possibility that this individual might be Mr. McNabney. He was in possession of some type of poster, a missing persons poster. When we finished, the body was taken back to the sheriff coroner's office, and then we performed the autopsy the next day. It was the next day during the course of the autopsy that we were able to obtain fingerprints, and he was ultimately identified by fingerprint comparison.
The team had found Larry McNabney, but his body showed no signs of outward violence.
After I performed the autopsy, I only identified one injury, and that was a non-life-threatening injury that involved a contusion of back muscle. So I had no cause of death at the conclusion of the autopsy. Since I didn't have a cause of death, toxicology was very important.
The toxicology results revealed Larry McNabney had been poisoned with the horse tranquilizer xylazine. His body contained almost 27 times the known lethal dose.
It's a huge dose that's administered.
Elisa McNabney, being one of the few people with access to both xylazine and Larry, was the prime suspect. More incriminating evidence was to emerge from the condition of Larry's body.
After it became known when he was last seen alive, what was really striking was the good preservation of his body, given that it had been 5 months. I recall speaking to the lead detective about, well, how might his body have been preserved? And I recall her saying, well, his body could have been frozen. I said, no, it couldn't have been frozen, because when a body thaws after having been frozen, decomposition and actually the breakdown of the tissues, it starts quite rapidly, and the body ultimately looks very, very bad, which we didn't have in this case. So I suggested that the body was stored someplace relatively cool and in a place where insects wouldn't have activity. So could have been a trunk, a refrigerator, a chest, something that would be secure enough and cool enough to maintain the body, but not frozen.
Police obtained a search warrant to investigate Elisa and Larry McNabney's house in Woodbridge, just 15 minutes away from where he was found.
The police were actually able to find out that there had been, in fact, a refrigerator that I believe was kept in the garage of the McNabney residence. Ultimately, they were able to track down that refrigerator subsequently, and if memory serves, I think they identified some biologic material in that refrigerator that supported that Mr. McNabney had been stored in it.
Elisa and Sarah Dutra wrapped Larry's body in the bedsheet and wound duct tape around his lifeless form. They then dragged his body down the stairs into the garage and jammed him into the refrigerator before taping the fridge door shut. There he remained for 3 months. Sarah Dutra even saw fit to invite Larry's son to party at the house while his father's body lay entombed in the garage.
I think this is the only case I've had where a body was refrigerated and then kept cool and then buried later.
In mid-December, Elisa made the decision to move Larry.
She finally decides, I have to do something with Larry's remains. So it's at this point in time, she makes the decision to remove him from the refrigerator and now deposit his body in, of all places, a vineyard in the San Joaquin Valley.
Elisa and Sarah pulled up at the vineyard under the cover of darkness, where they dug the shallow grave. Hoisting Larry's body out of the trunk, they rolled him into it. They snipped off the Horseshoe logo from his t-shirt, but dropped the scissors into the darkness in the process.
In the wake of the discovery of Larry's body, she fled, wound up in Destin, Florida, a beach community there, and where she assumed another name. Let's keep in mind, she had been living a big lie for a protracted period of time. It stated that she had over 30 aliases, which is quite amazing when you think about it. And this one last time, she assumed one more identity and one more name. But it wasn't too long after that the sheriff's office caught up with her.
Elisa was now a federal fugitive. On March 18, 2002, police apprehended 35-year-old Elisa as she sat on the beach, smoking a joint, awaiting her fate.
And at that point in time, she made a total confession. She confessed to the murder of her husband. Following this confession, she was taken back to her jail cell. She wrote a suicide note, which indicated that any funds that are derived as a result of her death should go to her children. And of course, she hanged herself later in her cell.
Elisa's confession exposed Sarah Dutra's lies.
She was obviously implicated and was tried for murder. The decision was second-degree manslaughter.
Initially charged with first-degree murder, in March 2003, she was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Dutra's parents looked on as their daughter was sentenced to 11 years at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla.
And to have a daughter do something like that, I imagine, would be crushing. I mean, I'm sure that they would find it inexplicable how somebody of her upbringing and background could be even remotely involved in something like this. If my child were to do something like that, I would be devastated.
Sarah Dutra was 31 years old when she was released in August 2011, free to resume her artistic career. Larry McNabney's children, meanwhile, cling to the memory of their confident, charismatic dad. When Fresno County Sheriff officers took their cars to be repaired, the possibility that the friendly garage superintendent could be capable of murder was the last thing on their minds.
He worked with machines, he had mechanical skills. It fit his action, that he actually cared about things more than other people.
It would seem that David Catlin doesn't have the ability to empathize with people in his life. Since an early age, he's been stealing. He is a domestic abuser. He takes advantage of women that are in his life and eventually brings about their deaths.
Born in 1944, Stephen David Catlin grew up in the Central Valley, the agricultural hub of California.
He had grown up in Bakersfield with his mother. He was adopted. A legend, part of the thing I've been told, is that he was disciplined by his mother when he would misbehave. She would make him stand outside the road in a dress. I don't know if that's true. It didn't come in the record. That's part of the legend, and maybe that's what caused animosity toward his mother.
After dropping out of high school, Catlin soon became a student of crime, serving time for forgery when he was only 19. Returning to Bakersfield, in 1966 he married the second of his 6 wives, using an alias, having never officially divorced his first wife.
One of the interesting facts about David is that back in 1966, relative to his first wife, while they were in a moving vehicle together, he opens the door and he attempts to push her out of the vehicle. She was greatly injured as a result of this, and David thought no more of this than to simply go to the local drugstore, buy her some aspirin, and then take her back home. This, of course, gives us an indication that David has a long simmering problem with anger.
Catlin became a mechanic and found work fixing farming equipment.
This is an agri-based culture that you have in this area. So you're going to have a lot of farm equipment. You'll have a lot of farm supply stores, for instance. There'll be people there that sell tractors and repair tractors. Everything is kind of geared toward the production of food.
Within 10 years, he had divorced 3 times. His third wife was Edith Ballou, but that marriage ended after 8 months. By 1976, he was once again based in Bakersfield and married to his 4th wife, Joyce.
Joyce had a lot. She came from Utah. She had a lot of kids. She was an attractive woman.
But Catlin had found another attraction in Fresno: cars, and the stepdaughter of racing driver Glendon Emery. While still married to Joyce, he pursued her.
We think the reason for leaving Joyce was because he wanted to become a race car driver. And Glenda, the next wife's father, had race cars. He had a little machine shop and he had some race cars, so that may have been the motive why he wanted to get rid of Joyce.
With 3 divorces under his belt, Catlin had drawn the ire of his mother.
Again, this is part of the legend that his mother, sort of a strict person, didn't approve of all his divorces. So instead of divorcing his 3rd wife, Joyce, he murdered her by poisoning her with paraquat.
Paraquat is a potent and highly effective herbicide.
Paraquat is a highly lethal substance that is actually used as a herbicide. That means that you can apply paraquat to, say, for instance, unwanted weeds and this sort of thing that are growing in an area. It's a chemical that you would find in a large farming community.
Paraquat is designed to kill vegetation. On contact with human tissue, its effects are shocking.
People talk about exposure to paraquat relative to, say, the airway and the lungs itself, and it's described as burning the respiratory tissue, so it's highly caustic.
In April 1976, Joyce began to feel ill. Her back was sore, she was vomiting, and she came on with a sore throat.
The initial symptomology or onset of paraquat poisoning is going to give the appearance that the individual is obviously in respiratory distress. That could easily be mistaken as, say, for instance, a bronchial pneumonia, for instance. Maybe intestinal conditions where you might think that the person has the flu.
Within a day of being admitted to Bakersfield Mercy Hospital, Joyce was in intensive care. Her lungs were under assault, but her doctors couldn't establish from what.
When paraquat comes into contact with the mucoid surfaces, it's highly caustic. It can burn these areas as well as burn the lungs.
Joyce was in a critical condition. She was afflicted with pulmonary fibrosis.
Pulmonary fibrosis is literally a firming or a hardening of the lung tissue. Imagine, if you will, a sponge, and you apply heat to the sponge, and the sponge begins to almost contract or melt. The sponge is no longer viable. With pulmonary fibrosis, it acts much like this. So those areas of the lung that are impacted by pulmonary fibrosis will become rendered essentially useless at that point in time. In other words, the patient is no longer capable of taking on oxygen in that particular area, so it compromises the individual's ability to breathe.
After 19 days in hospital, Joyce succumbed on May 6, 1976. Following an autopsy, her cause of death was recorded as acute respiratory failure due to unknown microorganisms. But doctors had their suspicions. Her condition showed all the hallmarks of paraquat poisoning, from as little as a tablespoon's worth.
There was no test for paraquat back in 1976 when David's wife Joyce was poisoned.
One of the doctors had some suspicion that something was wrong, but there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. The body was cremated and things moved on.
At autopsy, the physicians there took samples, tissue samples, of her lungs, of her heart, of her liver, and retained these samples, hoping that in the future they could find more answers to what exactly had brought about her death.
Catlin's third wife, Edith Ballou, was also suspicious. She relayed her concerns to the police and the local district attorney, but a lack of evidence stymied any meaningful investigations. Catlin was free to marry his fifth wife, Glenna, in May 1977. Relocating to live in Fresno, he was welcomed into her family.
He had lived on the house with them. They had treated him like a son. They had given him the opportunity to raise a car. And they had taken this man in and part of the family.
In Fresno, his mechanical career was on the rise. He was soon overseeing 40 employees at a local garage and formed part of his new father-in-law's racing pit crew. But in 1981, his career hit a wall. Auto parts went missing from the garage, and Catlin's criminal record was revealed. Though no charges were pressed, Catlin had to leave. By 1984, his marriage to Glenna was under serious strain from his alleged infidelity. Already under financial stress, he needed a bailout. He sought one from Glenna's life insurance policy. That February, Glenna started to get ill. When she was admitted to hospital, she would spend 22 days there.
Their lungs are just become so brittle they can't take the oxygen in and expel the carbon dioxide, and you just die. And it's about a 4-week process. You're bedridden. Doctors are trying to help you, but they really can't. There's nothing they can do, and then you just expire. So it is not a pretty way to die.
Glenna died on March 14th, 1984.
Glenna mysteriously died. It was in the wake of her death that David actually collected $56,000 from an insurance policy.
His attempts to play the grieving widower appeared hollow to one witness.
She saw him laughing with his friends. He didn't know she was there. And then sort of like, well, this is just, it's not the stance a grieving husband would have. And so I think he could like turn it on and off. And so as soon as he saw her, he stopped, and then he became this grieving husband. So I think that shows the insight to him. He knew what he was doing, and he was probably smart enough man to get away with it.
Within 6 months, Catlin was stepping out with a new lady, Carol Johnson.
His mother, Martha, did not approve of David's lifestyle. She accused him of philandering, of being married multiple times, and she was rather disgusted by him. It's at that point in time that she threatened to send all of her inheritance upon her death to a local African Violet Association, and this put David off substantially.
On December 2nd, 1984, the couple traveled to Bakersfield to visit Catlin's 79-year-old mother, Martha. According to Carol, Martha was feeling fluey.
We have these symptoms, and the symptoms don't coincide when he had access to the victim. Well, the doctor explained, well, those symptoms were different from the paraquat symptoms, so it could have been just a normal flu.
7 days later, Martha was dead.
He can say, well, I wasn't even in Bakersfield at the time she started getting sick. So I think he would wait until they got sick and then apply the paraquat then. And then people were like, well, she's just getting worse and worse and worse. And the doctors couldn't figure out when she would have got poisoned. It wouldn't be as suspicious. So I think he had a mind that he was a very smart man. He could plan these things out, and I think he knew all these things. He knew how not to get caught, and he knew what he could get away with. And then, but for Edie Ballou, he probably would have gotten away with it.
In spite of Martha's threats, Catlin was the sole beneficiary of her estate.
And we did have a small motive. I think he had a small inheritance from her, but no one else would want to kill this lady.
Police at last investigated. They discovered a bottle of paraquat in the garage Catlin had worked at. And on the cap was Catlin's fingerprint. Meanwhile, in the laboratories, science was catching up with Catlin's crimes.
Let's jump forward a bit and think about the deaths that occurred in 1984. Both Glenna and Martha. In both of those cases, the authorities now had the ability to test for paraquat poisoning. Now, one of the other things that they would have done is taken a look at these tissues that they took from these two women at autopsy and then compared them to the tissues that they took in 1976 at Joyce's autopsy. And strangely enough, the morphology in all three of these cases matched up.
In 1986, Catlin was tried for the murder of Glenna K. Catlin.
It devastated the The victims I talked to most were Glenda's parents. To be betrayed and kill their daughter, they were still angry, and this was years later when I talked to them, almost too angry that it came through on their testimony that they were upset. And I went to their house to look at the scene and everything, and you could still feel the grief they had.
The trial was held in Monterey County to protect Catlin against a potentially prejudiced jury in Fresno. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. But the law hadn't finished with him yet. Catlin was to face a second trial for the murder of his fourth wife, Joyce, and his mother, Martha. Prosecutor Jesse Witt met with Joyce's family.
Joyce's family, I met the sister, and it had been, by the time I saw her, it's 76 to 89, 90, so some time had passed. And I think she was still surprised because she had known this man also as a brother-in-law, and I don't know if it ever clicked in, that he killed my sister.
While the depravity of his crimes shook Joyce's family, Catlin showed little remorse, but ample arrogance.
He thought he was going to walk out. He thought he was going to have the Fresno case, which has already been affirmed on appeal, set aside. I think it takes a different kind of mind to be, I don't know if he's delusional or just overly optimistic or supremely confident in his own abilities, that somehow he could have pulled that off. He got a little angry there. But I think he thought he was going to walk out of that courtroom a free man, even though a rational person looking at evidence. So you have these 3 women are dead, and they've tied you the paraquat, and you've got motive, and nobody else in the world would want to kill all these 3 women with this paraquat.
David Catlin's inability to acknowledge the pain and the suffering that these women went through in the throes of death just further demonstrates how disconnected from reality he truly is. These were painful, horrendous deaths that they suffered, and he seems to be unwilling to take any personal responsibility for it.
On June 1st, 1990, 14 years after Joyce's death, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty.
And I think he was very shocked that the jury did not accept his story and found him guilty. So that would be finally, the comeuppance. You got away with this game for so long. The game is over. You're caught. The rest of your life's in prison.
On June 6th, 1990, the court reconvened for sentencing.
And then after the jury came back with the verdict, we had a couple days break, and we came back for the penalty phase, starting the penalty phase, and it wasn't the same person. He was shoulders down. He looked older, visibly, like when you see, people go gray. That's how he looked. He looked like a beaten man.
The jury sentenced him to death. In appealing his death penalty, Catlin's rationale was disturbing.
In his appeal, David Catlin actually stated that since it was a poisoning, that he brought about the deaths of these 3 women vis-a-vis poison, that he should not be considered for the death penalty, as if poisoning is a gentle way to die. In the case of all 3 of these women, this was not a passive event. This was a gruesome, horrendous death that actually wound up with these women spending their final days in mortal pain.
Mortal pain that has left scars on their loved ones left behind.
I don't know if the Emery family would ever recover from that way. It's one thing to have a stranger kill someone you know, but then to have someone who you took in as part of your family to kill, I think would have to be worse. Because you would feel like, well, why didn't I see this? What could I have done to protect my daughter?
As the families have tried to get on with their lives, Catlin remains locked up on death row in San Quentin prison.